Hi, I'm Patrick, and today I'm diving into the cold side of space to look at the most disturbing final moments of astronauts who never made it back home. From Soyuz 11, where the cabin suddenly lost pressure mid-descent, to Challenger, where a launch witnessed by millions ended in disaster just seconds after liftoff. It was June 30th, 1971. The Soyuz 11 spacecraft was returning to Earth after completing its mission aboard Salyut 1 over Soviet Kazakhstan. Georgy T. Dobrovolsky, a fighter pilot making his first trip to space. Vladislav T. Volkov, 35, handled the spacecraft systems and was the only one who had been to space before, on Soyuz 7. Viktor the Firstermpatsayev, 38, focused on science work, including running the Orion 1 ultraviolet telescope. All three were originally backups, but just 3 days before launch, they were moved up after a medical issue grounded Valery Kubasov. They flew inside a tight descent capsule, where survival depended completely on keeping the cabin sealed, since they didn't wear pressure suits during launch, docking, or return because of how the spacecraft was designed. Launched on June 6, 1971, they successfully docked with Salyut 1, the first space station ever built, and spent almost 3 weeks in orbit doing medical experiments, Earth observation, and checking how the station itself performed. By June 29th, the mission was finished. The crew packed film and experiment data into the return capsule and closed the hatch between Soyuz 11 and Salyut 1. A warning light came on, suggesting the seal might not be tight, so they opened it again and reclosed it, while ground control talked them through it. The warning stayed on, but after checking the readings, both the crew and mission control decided it was safe enough to continue. I'd probably treat that as a minor issue too. Nothing there clearly points to what's coming. After undocking and slowly flying around Salyut 1 one last time to take photos, Soyuz 11 started its trip back to Earth early on June 30th. The engine burn lasted about 187 seconds and set them on the right path for re-entry. A few minutes later, small explosive bolts separated the spacecraft into sections, leaving only the descent capsule carrying the crew heading down toward Earth. During this separation, a cabin pressure equalization valve, designed to open later in descent to balance internal pressure with the external atmosphere, opened prematurely. The cause was a combination of mechanical shock and design vulnerability. The valve opened during the separation phase in high orbit, exposing the cabin to vacuum conditions. The cabin pressure dropped instantly. Air rushed out in seconds, and the inside of the capsule went from normal to vacuum conditions almost right away. With no pressure suits, the crew had no real protection against that kind of exposure. Oxygen was gone almost immediately, and they would have lost consciousness within moments. The capsule itself kept working and followed its normal re-entry path, even though the inside was no longer survivable. The data that came back was limited and didn't clearly show what the crew went through in those final seconds. There was no voice contact, which at first wasn't seen as unusual because blackout during re-entry was expected. Later analysis found only small, unclear signs in the readings, and nothing that could confirm any actions from the crew during the decompression. Medical reconstruction estimated loss of useful consciousness within seconds of rapid decompression, with death occurring within approximately 1 to 2 minutes. Once cabin pressure was lost, survival was not possible. From mission control, the descent appeared normal. Radar tracking continued, and the capsule followed its expected trajectory. The parachute deployed correctly, and no external signs indicated a failure. From the ground, it would have looked like a routine return. Recovery helicopters confirmed a normal parachute descent east of Zhezkazgan. Ground teams reached the capsule shortly after landing, but received no response. After opening the module, medical personnel confirmed all 3 cosmonauts were dead, with death occurring during descent and no possibility of resuscitation. The official investigation concluded that rapid decompression was caused by a premature opening of the cabin pressure equalization valve during module separation. Its vulnerability to mechanical shock, combined with the lack of pressure suits, made survival impossible. Manual correction would have taken longer than the time available before loss of consciousness. After the accident, Soyuz flights were stopped while the spacecraft was redesigned. The crew was reduced to 2 so they could wear pressure suits, and the valve system was changed to stop it from opening by mistake. These fixes became standard for all later Soyuz missions. Just a few years before that, Soyuz 1 had already shown how things could go wrong during descent, when systems started failing one after another. It was April 24, 1967. The Soyuz 1 spacecraft was descending toward Earth after completing its final orbit, aiming for a landing in Orenburg Oblast in the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. Vladimir Mikhailovich Komarov, 40, was the mission commander, a Soviet Air Force colonel and test pilot who had already flown in space on Voskhod 1. He was picked for Soyuz 1 because of his experience with experimental spacecraft, even though earlier medical checks had raised some concerns. Yuri Gagarin was his backup. Soyuz 1 was the first crewed test of a new spacecraft built for future docking missions. It launched on April 23, 1967, and reached orbit, but soon after, one solar panel failed to open, cutting power and affecting key systems. Navigation started acting up, and communication with ground control became unreliable. Komarov spent several orbits trying to manually steady the spacecraft, but it kept drifting. With power dropping and control getting worse, Mission Control decided the flight couldn't continue, and the follow-up mission, Soyuz 2, was cancelled before launch. With the mission no longer sustainable, Mission Control ordered an early return. Re-entry required manual control due to unreliable stabilization systems. Using the Visor optical sight, Komarov aligned the spacecraft with the Sun and maintained orientation through gyroscopic control as it moved into darkness. After 19 orbits, the retro-rocket burn was completed successfully, setting Soyuz 1 on a descent trajectory toward the landing zone. And even then, there's still no obvious sign anything is about to go wrong. During re-entry, the recovery system began its sequence. The drogue parachute deployed first to stabilize the capsule and extract the main parachute. However, the drogue failed to function correctly in pulling out the main canopy. The main parachute did not fully deploy, preventing proper deceleration. A backup parachute came out automatically, but it got tangled up with the drogue chute lines. Instead of helping slow the capsule down, the two chutes ended up interfering with each other. As a result, neither one could do its job, and the capsule was left with no working way to slow its descent. As the capsule continued its uncontrolled descent, no further corrective action was possible. The spacecraft entered the atmosphere at high velocity, descending rapidly toward the surface. At approximately 6:24 a.m., Soyuz 1 impacted the ground near Orsk, in Orenburg Oblast. The force of the collision destroyed the descent module on impact. Residual propellant ignited shortly after, causing a fire at the crash site. Komarov was killed instantly due to the extreme impact forces. It's hard not to think how close this was to just being another routine return. Recovery teams later located the remains in the wreckage. An official investigation concluded the cause of death was catastrophic parachute system failure during descent. The main parachute did not deploy correctly, and the reserve became entangled with the drogue chute, preventing deceleration. The report also noted earlier spacecraft malfunctions, including a failed solar panel and resulting electrical instability, which reduced power and degraded navigation and attitude control. While the parachute failure was the immediate cause of impact, these earlier system failures were identified as contributing factors. Following the Soyuz 1 disaster, the Soviet space program suspended crewed Soyuz flights for approximately 18 months. Engineers undertook a major redesign of the spacecraft, focusing on parachute deployment reliability, electrical systems, and structural integrity. Improvements were made to redundancy systems and separation sequences to prevent entanglement failures. These changes were put in place before Soyuz flights started again, and they became the new safety rules for all later Soviet and Russian crewed space missions. Much later, Columbia showed something different, where everything seemed fine until damage done earlier in the flight finally caught up during re-entry. It was February 1st, 2003. Space Shuttle Columbia was descending over the continental United States during re-entry from its STS-107 mission. Rick D. Husband, age 45, was the mission commander, a U.S. Air Force colonel and test pilot. William C. McCool, age 41, was the pilot and a U.S. Navy commander on his first spaceflight. Michael P. Anderson, age 43, was payload commander, a U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel and veteran astronaut. David M. Brown, age 46, was a mission specialist, naval aviator, and flight surgeon. Kalpana Chawla, age 41, was a mission specialist and aerospace engineer. Laurel Blair Salton Clark, age 41, was a mission specialist and U.S. Navy flight surgeon. Ilan Ramon, age 47, was the payload specialist, an Israeli Air Force colonel, and the first Israeli astronaut. STS-107 was a dedicated science mission not linked to the International Space Station. Over 16 days in orbit, the crew completed more than 80 experiments in combustion, fluid dynamics, materials science, atmospheric research, and life sciences. Work was done in 2 shifts to allow continuous operation. Columbia was protected by a heat shield made of carbon panels on the wing edges and heat-resistant tiles on the rest of the body to handle the extreme heat of re-entry. The mission launched on January 16, 2003, from Kennedy Space Center. About 81 seconds after liftoff, foam from the external tank struck the left wing's leading edge. The impact was recorded on video, but its severity was not immediately understood. Foam shedding had occurred on earlier missions and was not treated as an immediate threat. After launch, engineers identified the foam strike and requested high-resolution imagery of Columbia in orbit to assess potential damage. These requests were not approved. The crew was informed of the strike, but told it was not a safety concern. The mission continued normally, with no onboard indication of damage. During orbit, everything on Columbia seemed normal. The crew finished their experiments, and nothing on the spacecraft showed any obvious problems. There were no warnings about damage to the left wing. On February 1st, they started the usual steps for re-entry. During re-entry, temperature sensors in the left wing began showing abnormal readings, indicating that hot atmospheric gases were entering areas not designed for such heat. Additional data showed rising temperatures in the wheel well and increasing structural stress. The crew continued normal re-entry operations without direct awareness of the developing failure. As the descent continued, heating intensified and structural degradation accelerated. Mission Control briefly contacted Commander Husband regarding a tire pressure issue. He acknowledged the call, but the transmission ended abruptly mid-response. Within moments, structural failure escalated beyond recovery. That cutoff in communication hits differently, like a sentence interrupted and never finished. Superheated plasma entered the left wing through the damaged leading edge, progressively destroying internal structures. As aluminum components weakened and melted, aerodynamic forces overwhelmed the wing. The orbiter became uncontrollable and broke apart over northeastern Texas, with debris spreading across Texas and Louisiana. During breakup, portions of the crew cabin remained partially intact as the vehicle disintegrated. The investigation concluded that the crew did not survive the breakup due to extreme structural forces and loss of cabin integrity. The exact timing and manner of death could not be determined. No survivable window existed once structural failure progressed. Thousands of searchers covered about 2.3 million acres and found over 2,000 debris sites. The remains of all 7 astronauts were recovered, mostly from one area, and returned to their families after identification. Even after everything scattered, the search still had to be done piece by piece. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board determined the physical cause of the accident was a breach in the thermal protection system caused by foam impact during launch. This allowed superheated gases to penetrate the wing during re-entry, leading to structural collapse. Contributing factors included the normalization of foam shedding and the failure to obtain high-resolution imagery that could have assessed the damage. The investigation also identified organizational issues, including communication breakdowns and the normalization of known risks within NASA's decision-making structure. Following the disaster, the shuttle fleet was grounded while safety reforms were implemented, including improved inspection procedures, enhanced thermal protection repair capability, and upgraded launch imaging systems. The shuttle program resumed flights in 2005 under revised safety protocols. Unlike Columbia, Challenger didn't fail on the way back. It started falling apart right at launch when cold weather pushed a small problem past its limit. It was January 28, 1986. Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Kennedy Space Center in Florida on mission STS-51L before breaking apart during ascent over the Atlantic Ocean. Francis Richard Scobie, age 46, was the mission commander, a U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel and experienced astronaut. Michael J. Smith, age 40, was the pilot on his first spaceflight, a U.S. Navy commander and test pilot. Ellison S. Onizuka, age 39, was a mission specialist, U.S. Air Force colonel, and veteran astronaut. Judith A. Resnick, age 36, was a mission specialist and electrical engineer. Ronald E. McNair, age 35, was a mission specialist, physicist, and veteran astronaut. Gregory B. Jarvis, age 41, was a payload specialist and engineer from Hughes Aircraft. Krista McAuliffe, age 37, was a payload specialist and teacher selected through NASA's Teacher in Space project. STS-51L was the 25th flight of the Space Shuttle program and the 10th flight of Challenger. The mission included deployment of the Tracking and Data Relay Satellite, TDRSB, and scientific experiments, along with McAuliffe's planned educational lessons from orbit. The shuttle system used two solid rocket boosters attached to an external fuel tank. Each booster had field joints sealed by rubber O-rings designed to prevent hot gases from escaping during ascent. Cold weather had delayed the launch several times, and when it finally went up, it was colder than normal for Florida. Ice had built up on the launch tower. Engineers were already worried because the rubber seals in the rocket joints had shown wear on earlier flights, and cold temperatures made them less flexible and less reliable. On the night before launch, engineers from the booster manufacturer recommended delaying the mission due to predicted temperatures below their safety threshold. Despite this, the launch proceeded after management discussions. Challenger lifted off at 11:38 a.m. Eastern Standard Time in conditions colder than any previous shuttle flight. It went up anyway, despite hesitation that never fully disappeared. Shortly after ignition, smoke was observed coming from the right solid rocket booster's aft joint, indicating early O-ring failure. Hot gases began leaking past the primary seal, which had not properly seated due to the cold temperature. The secondary seal also failed to fully contain the gases, allowing continued erosion of the joint structure. For nearly a minute, the leak was partially contained by debris and combustion byproducts, temporarily slowing the damage. As flight continued, the escaping gases intensified into a visible flame that extended toward the external fuel tank. The flame increased under aerodynamic stress, eventually striking the structural attachment between the booster and the tank. The lower attachment point failed under sustained heating and pressure imbalance. This allowed the right booster to pivot outward, bringing it into contact with the external tank. The tank, filled with supercold liquid hydrogen and oxygen under high pressure, was hit and damaged, causing it to break open. The resulting structural breakup occurred rapidly as fuel was released and ignited. Challenger disintegrated under aerodynamic forces, with the crew compartment separating from the rest of the vehicle. The solid rocket boosters continued briefly on uncontrolled trajectories before being destroyed by range safety systems. Evidence showed parts of the crew cabin remained recognizable after breakup. Some emergency air systems were found activated, though it's unclear when. The cabin had no way to slow or control its descent and ultimately impacted the Atlantic Ocean at high speed, leading to complete destruction. Recovery operations located debris and remains over several weeks across a wide ocean area. The crew cabin was recovered later, and all 7 astronauts were identified and returned to their families after forensic examination. The Rogers Commission concluded that the accident was caused by failure of the solid rocket booster O-rings, directly linked to cold launch conditions. It also identified broader contributing factors, including prior knowledge of seal vulnerabilities and communication failures between engineers and management. Following the disaster, the Space Shuttle program was suspended for nearly 3 years. The solid rocket boosters were redesigned with improved sealing systems, and NASA implemented new safety review processes and oversight structures before flights resumed. After those big spacecraft failures, risk shifted to life inside orbit itself, where even simple onboard equipment could turn dangerous during normal routines. It was January 27, 1967. Inside the Apollo 1 command module on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy, a routine pre-flight systems test was underway when a sudden onboard fire turned a controlled ground procedure into a fatal emergency within seconds. Virgil Hy Grissom, age 40, was the mission commander, a U.S. Air Force officer and one of NASA's earliest astronauts with prior spaceflight experience. Edward H. White II, age 36, was the senior pilot, a U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel and the first American to perform a spacewalk. Roger B. Chaffee, age 31, was a U.S. Navy lieutenant and astronaut preparing for his first spaceflight, assigned to monitor communications and spacecraft systems during the test. Apollo 1 was a ground-based test of the Block 1 Apollo command module, designed to validate spacecraft systems ahead of its first crewed orbital mission. The cabin was sealed and pressurized with a pure oxygen atmosphere at higher than atmospheric pressure to simulate certain flight conditions. This setup was normal for testing at the time, but it made the inside of the capsule much more likely to catch fire because of the oxygen-rich air. The crew was secured in their seats inside a very tight space, and they couldn't get out on their own without help from outside. The test was part of a simulated countdown procedure, during which engineers monitored communications, electrical systems, and environmental controls. The spacecraft contained extensive wiring bundles, control panels, and flammable interior materials, all operating within a pressurized, oxygen-rich atmosphere. During the procedure, an electrical fault occurred inside the cabin. The exact ignition point was later identified within wiring beneath or near the crew compartment, though the precise initiating sequence could not be fully reconstructed. It's one of those things where the exact trigger still feels just out of reach. Once ignition occurred, the fire spread rapidly through the cabin due to the oxygen-rich environment. Within seconds, temperatures and smoke levels increased sharply. The crew immediately reported the emergency, but communication quickly became disrupted as heat and smoke filled the module. The internal pressure also began to rise, making movement inside the capsule increasingly difficult. The hatch system on Apollo 1 was designed to open inward and required multiple steps to remove, including release of latches under internal pressure. As conditions inside the cabin deteriorated, internal pressure and heat prevented the hatch from being opened from within or quickly from outside. Ground crews detected the emergency and attempted to assist, but the time required to open the external access panels exceeded the rapidly developing conditions inside the spacecraft. Within a very short period, visibility inside the capsule was lost. The fire consumed flammable materials and generated dense smoke and toxic gases. The crew's ability to communicate was cut off as systems failed. Rescue personnel outside the spacecraft continued emergency access attempts, but structural and mechanical barriers delayed entry into the cabin. Inside, everything shut down fast. After external access was finally achieved, the fire was extinguished. However, conditions inside the capsule had already reached a lethal state. All three astronauts had died from a combination of smoke inhalation, thermal injury, and the inability to escape the sealed environment. The Apollo spacecraft was later taken apart and studied in detail. Investigators found that the most likely cause of the fire was an electrical fault in the command module's wiring. Other factors that made the situation worse included damaged or weak wire insulation, the use of a high-pressure pure oxygen atmosphere inside the cabin, and materials inside the spacecraft that could easily burn. The inward opening hatch and elevated internal pressure were identified as critical design limitations that prevented timely escape. The investigation concluded that the accident resulted from a combination of electrical, environmental, and design-related factors rather than a single point of failure. A small ignition event escalated rapidly in a confined, oxygen-rich cabin with no viable means of egress. Following the accident, all crewed Apollo missions were suspended while the spacecraft was redesigned. Changes included switching to a safer mixed gas system, improving wiring insulation and routing, reducing flammable materials, and redesigning the hatch for rapid outward opening. Ground testing and safety reviews were also strengthened before flights resumed. After this, attention shifted not only to orbit, but also to the edge of space itself, where high-speed test flights revealed how quickly control could be lost once systems started failing. It was November 15, 1967. High above the Mojave Desert in California, the X-15 experimental rocket plane was on a suborbital test flight, reaching the edge of space before beginning its descent back toward Earth. Michael J. Adams, age 37, was the pilot. He was a U.S. Air Force major and test pilot assigned to the X-15 program, a joint effort involving NASA and the U.S. Air Force to study flight at extreme speed and altitude. Each mission pushed the aircraft closer to conditions similar to spaceflight, collecting data for future spacecraft design. He wasn't just flying, he was testing the edge of what flight could survive. The X-15 was carried to high altitude under a B-52 bomber and released mid-air. After separation, Adams ignited the rocket engine and climbed steeply. On this flight, he reached about 50 miles, crossing the boundary of space recognized by the U.S. Air Force. From there, the aircraft entered its descent phase, transitioning back into the atmosphere at extreme speed. At this point, the aircraft was moving through very fast-changing conditions. Up high in the atmosphere, the air is so thin that the control surfaces barely respond, so even small mistakes can build up quickly. As the X-15 came down, it hit thicker air, and both air pressure and heat increased within seconds, shifting it from a near weightless glide into a much more intense and physically demanding flight environment. During the mission, electrical disturbances affected onboard instruments and navigation displays. At the same time, the aircraft was already in a fragile phase of flight where stability depended on precise control. With partial instrument disruption, it became harder to confirm exact orientation and correct minor deviations in real time, increasing the workload on manual control. As the descent continued, the aircraft began to drift off its intended flight path. The motion gradually developed into yaw and roll that were difficult to counter. At high speed, even small deviations can quickly escalate, and the aircraft started losing stable alignment with its descent corridor, moving further away from the planned recovery trajectory. It doesn't drift far at first, but it builds quickly. Adams attempted to recover control using manual inputs. However, the aircraft continued to depart from stable flight. Telemetry sent to ground control showed increasing instability, though the full situation inside the cockpit was not immediately clear, as data lag and instrument limitations reduced real-time understanding of how quickly the situation was developing. As the X-15 descended further, aerodynamic forces rose sharply. The vehicle entered an uncontrolled spin as it passed through increasing atmospheric density. In this condition, the aircraft started to experience uneven pressure across its body, putting a lot of strain on parts that were never built to handle long periods of sideways or off-balance forces at that speed. The aircraft then began to break apart mid-air due to forces exceeding its structural limits. The disintegration occurred over the desert at extreme speed, and the pilot did not survive. Once structural failure began at that altitude and velocity, recovery was not possible. Search teams later recovered debris scattered across a wide area. Investigation showed that electrical disturbances, instrument errors, and loss of controlled flight all contributed during a critical phase of descent. The combination led to spatial disorientation and progressive loss of stability. The official findings concluded there was no single cause. Instead, multiple factors developed together during a narrow and high-risk phase of flight. Electrical interference reduced clarity of instruments, while atmospheric transition increased aerodynamic stress and reduced control margin. Once the aircraft exceeded its structural tolerance during the uncontrolled descent, breakup became inevitable. The X-15 design did not allow recovery from such a condition at that speed and altitude. Following the accident, remaining X-15 flights continued with improved procedures, better instrument shielding, and updated training for high-altitude disorientation. The program later ended, but its data became important for future spacecraft and re-entry vehicle design. Michael J. Adams was later awarded astronaut wings posthumously, recognizing that the flight reached space conditions despite using an experimental aircraft.